I personally think it's very important, but so do a lot of other people. And you can see some of these interesting quotes here on the slide, but they bring up that there's really two main reasons why we are discussing women's economic empowerment. First of all, is really because gender equality and empowering women and girls is simply the right thing to do, right? We can all agree that women and girls, deserve a life with options to work, options in safety, and also for their health. And the second thing that I want to bring up is that empowering women is also smart economics. It's smart economics and it's smart business. And there's many different studies coming up right now, which are referenced in the paper, that show that investments in private sector development that promote women's economic empowerment yield higher returns in terms of poverty reduction and broader positive results, such as outcomes in children's school and health, than private sector development projects that do not focus on women's empowerment. So I think that's just an important piece to note. The second piece I want to talk about is what is economic empowerment, women's economic empowerment. And I think for those of you who have a lot of experience in this, you might already know this, but I do want to do a quick overview because there's really two key components. And a lot of the definitions around women's economic empowerment draw from Amartya Sen's approach to capabilities, which says that you have these two components. The first one they call access to resources, and the second one typically revolves around what we call in empowerment literature, which is called agency. So access to resources typically focuses around the ability to succeed and advance economically. And then agency, even though it's a little bit jargony, is really focusing around the power to make and act on those economic decisions and those actual opportunities that people are presented with. I'm going to also review right now a few of the common women's economic empowerment approaches for those of you who are less familiar. So what we've done here, this is based on the case studies as well as some literature. And what we've done is created kind of a spectrum of private sector development programming and how they focus on women's economic empowerment. So what we did is we kind of started with almost like a gold star standard and then moved it all the way through to where there's no focus on gender at all. And you can see that's the sixth piece. So in terms of the combination, that's really where you see programming, and this is what both M4C and ALCP do. They have a combination approach where they both they apply a gender mainstreaming approach and a women-targeted approach, and they decide when to apply the different approaches based on the intervention. And we've seen that to be quite effective. Just to quickly go through a couple of the key concepts, women-targeted typically means that your interventions only target female beneficiaries, and that women's economic empowerment is the actual key objective of the project. Where in gender mainstreaming, it's a bit different, right? You have projects who are targeting both men and women's economic empowerment might be only one of your key objectives to the project. And then gender aware is really where projects do not have women's empowerment as a key objective, and that they're just mainly bringing it on to understand some of the gender concerns and maybe integrate women's economic empowerment into certain aspects of their project. And then do no harm is where programs seek to avoid negative impacts on women's economic empowerment, and it typically is not an actual key objective for the project. So let's see the next slide. So the next piece, we're going to go through some key elements where we see projects who focus on women's economic empowerment and how they succeed. And all of these lessons, like I said, are drawn upon the M4C and ALCP programs. So what we saw in both of those programs is that they had very strong gender responsive market research. And this was really absolutely critical into how they were able to design their results measurement system. So it's very linked. Both of the projects follow, oh, Jim's telling me to be louder. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, you are good.
Okay, good. So both of the projects use Markets for the Poor operational guidelines, and so they follow that approach for their market research. So you can see that they integrated gender responsive market research into all levels of their research. It was completely integrated. So they did not do a separate gender analysis and a separate market analysis. They actually built in the gender pieces into every piece of research they did. So I thought I can turn now to Fazia. I don't know if Helen is there yet, and ask her what some of your key lessons learned were when you were conducting this gender market research.
Hi, Erin. Yeah, okay. I hope everyone can hear me. Yeah, on that, Erin, like you mentioned, it was very important for us at the beginning of the program to integrate understanding of the roles of men and women in the sectors we are working. So what we actually even started off with when we had a list of criteria to select the sectors even, we did have one of the criteria as how well can this sector include women if it has to grow economically in terms of the market systems improve. So that was very important for us, and I think for me and the team initially it was very important to really understand, like I said, where the women are in these sectors, what kind of information and skills were required for them to better contribute to the sectors, who were the potential providers for these kind of services, be it skills, knowledge, input, and what were the constraints which did not allow them to access those kind of services. So if I can maybe just mention some of the lessons learned from our side is that a very basic and very, very practical thing is that when we are analyzing a sector in any PhD or M4P programs, we always do a value chain map. And what we tried to do when we did our research is to have a value chain map, and even at certain levels of the value chain, have separate boxes for men and women to identify what role they are playing at the same stage of production. So we just to make sure that we are doing it. I mean, we even colored some of the boxes that highlighted women's role in pink, so that we have a value chain where we have pink boxes that highlight where women are contributing to the sector. So, for example, in case of M4C, we found some sectors like the maize sector where women were mostly involved in post-harvest. Whereas in the other case, in another agriculture sector such as chili, we found that women were not only engaged in post-harvest techniques, but also played a very important role in retaining the seeds for the next season. So that was a very important and very practical thing for us to do, so that it was clear to the whole team in a pictorial format that where the role of women are and how can they be reached through the other service providers around them. That's number one. Number two, another lesson, we kind of did it through a more of a trial and trial error, that in certain cases we tried to include a lot of questions that we wanted to be answered during the market research, and which made the questionnaire, for example, very long. So we had questions including the roles, the decision making, and a lot of other indicators which would define the presence of women in the sector, but that made the research very difficult and very actually time-consuming. So what we did, we selected few questions that would help us, because it was initial research for us, that would at least help us get an overview of what they are doing and what are the constraints in the sector. And then after that, while designing an intervention, we went into more details of a particular activity. So we also knew that it was not possible to get everything from the first research we do. So we planned a bit more smaller and in-depth research depending on the sector. So I would say that's also important, because we don't also want to complicate the research in the beginning, so that we are not unable to even understand the overall context of the sector. So I would say that these would be one or two of the points related to the market research we did.
Great. Thank you, Fazia. I mean, I think, as you're saying, is just how critical that whole process was. And to be honest, how I was very impressed by both projects and what they were able to collect in terms of all of this. I'm guessing Helen is still not on the line. So I'll move now to the next slide. So what we did here is we came up with a strategic framework, and this is really based on the Making Markets Work for the Poor framework that they did, and then building on that and building women's economic empowerment directly into that framework. And so the key points to point out here is that it's integrated again, which I think you'll start seeing as a very common theme. And that I think one piece I do really want to point out is at that highest impact level, you're not only seeing poverty reduction, but you're also seeing enhanced empowerment at that top level. And that becomes particularly important when you're looking at household level measures of empowerment, which we'll get into a little bit more when we get to the indicator section. But what I did want to point out here is that both M4C and ALCP found that this process of developing results chains is quite a bit more straightforward for women's targeted interventions, as each step in the results chain focuses specifically on women and their empowerment. Where for gender mainstreamed interventions, where it's both focused on women and men, this can be a little bit more challenging, where some steps might need to be specific women's economic empowerment steps and activities and result statements, and others may not. And the one other piece that I wanted to mention here that both of these projects did in a very interesting way was to use their market research to inform not only the development of a strategic framework, but also in how they develop each and every result chain per intervention. So Fazia, I'd like to ask you again, what are some of the key lessons learned for developing gender responsive results chains? I know in one of your initiatives in the handicraft sector that was women targeted, I know you had some interesting lessons there, so maybe you can also speak to that.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. On the results chain, I think, as I mentioned, that once we did the initial market research, we designed the strategies, and then we, of course, designed the details of an intervention. And again, going back to the understanding of the roles of women in a particular sector, we try to think through how the women in these sectors could benefit through the required information, skills, and knowledge. So when we are developing any intervention, and like in any other M4P intervention, we definitely have to partner with either a private sector or a public sector to deliver that particular service. So we, during our partnership arrangement, even with these market actors, we make it very clear to them that a particular activity within the sector which is done by women needs focus, because there is, for example, in case of, I go back to my earlier example of maize, for example, where women are mostly involved in the post-harvest activities. So when we try to look at service providers who could provide information to these households on the chores on better post-harvest techniques, we made it sure that that the service providers are targeting women so that they get the information, because at the end of the day, the women are playing that role. So for us, once we knew the role of these women in the sector, it was important for us to really focus the service providers in a way, again, to look at the business perspective as well. Why would they reach women given their, given the situation of jobs which are very disconnected? So it's important for us in case of sectors where we see more integration, that we work with service providers who are ready to provide these services to the women. As opposed to the other sector which you mentioned, Erin, handicrafts, where clearly we've seen private sector, in fact, looking out for women handicraft producers, because as it is in any other country, handicrafts are made by women mostly. And there we were kind of very, I would say it was better. It was very clear that the private sector would develop models to reach the women on the chores. And for us there, when we designed the interventions, the service provider, which were basically the people of the company, were ready to serve the women on these chores to provide skills for that particular handicraft item and so on, so forth. So in those kind of targeted interventions, for us it was easy to get indicators related to how many, related to what kind of skills the women required, how did they actually use the skills, how much time did they use for making a particular handicraft, what effect did it have on their workload, because that's an important factor for us, because they are already looking into the household work as well as in some cases the agriculture work. So in those kind of targeted interventions, it was easy to really track down these indicators. Versus in the other one, where we are looking at women, for example, in the maize sector, it is usually a bit tricky because you have men and women also working at the same for the same crop. So there we again, while designing a results chain, we make sure we have enough indicators at different levels. In fact, use proxy indicators in some cases to make sure that we capture these effects properly. And then adding on to that, we try to do some qualitative studies, which Erin, you have mentioned in your report as well, that we try to do the qualitative re-studies to identify whether the results of these activities in the field are actually bringing out a broader change in the women on the job. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Fazia. Helen, are you now on the line, I heard?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay, yes, I am just on the line, I think.
Great, yeah, I think we can hear you.
Yes, you sound great, Helen.
Okay, good.
Helen, do you want to contribute at this point, or should we keep going?
Yeah, I actually couldn't really hear what that point was. Was it about results chain?
Yeah, exactly. We were talking about some of the key lessons for developing gender-responsive results chains.
Key lessons for developing results chains. Well, we have two different types. We have the gender mainstreamed results chains and the winning targeted results chains. And just the point really to say is that in some ways it's easier to do the women targeted results chains because you've got one main group for impact or target group. And there's a greater sophistication required in the targeted activities when you do a gender mainstreamed results chains, where you incorporate the separate stream for getting the same outcome for women or the same impact for women, but perhaps in a different way. That's it, really.
Great. Thank you. So I'm going to move us now into actually developing the women's economic empowerment indicators. And the these steps, that you see up here on the slide, are based on what we found with the M4C and ALC project. So the first piece that we found is that it's very helpful to have one or two indicators at the household level, in addition to the DCE standard universal indicators. And this we're mainly seeing project users at that impact level. And then from there, as we were talking about before, you have these two key issues around access to resources as well as agency. And access to resources includes indicators like increases in income, like household income, not enterprise income, which we'll talk about in a minute, skills development, employment opportunities, and then agency refers to indicators such as time use, decision-making ability, say around expenditures at the household level, and also something like physical mobility. And CARE International, an agency that's done quite a bit of work around women's empowerment, notes that programs who are successful at sustaining empowerment for women in the long term tend to address these multiple layers, basically, of a woman's empowerment, but really the access to resource and agency and that mix of this. And we saw that both with M4C and ALCC, that they really are looking at both of these. The next piece is around the strong qualitative indicators. I think this is very important and came out very strongly from both of the case studies, where most of the indicators at the household level could at least be complemented by or fully conducted using qualitative methods. And in the paper, we go into this in quite a lot of detail, talking about which indicators we recommend looking at qualitatively versus quantitatively, and for using qualitative and quantitative methods, I should say, and also which indicators also might need complementary qualitative follow-up if you are measuring it through quantitative methods to start. In terms of a unit of analysis, I think this is a very interesting piece that I'd like to stop and discuss with Fazia for a minute. But basically, this is a really important piece because different projects tend to measure at different levels. So once you have collected data at a certain unit of analysis, you cannot normally go back and further disaggregate your data. So for example, if you collect data at a household or an enterprise level, it is not going to be possible to disaggregate your data then by sex or by gender. So Fazia, I was hoping, because your team has done this really well and done a lot of thinking around this issue, and I was hoping that you could give us an example of the types of changes you measured using different units of analysis, and then explain how your program deals with this tension, I like to call it, between collecting enterprise-level data, which is very common for private sector development projects, versus individual level data, which is very common for empowerment projects.
Okay. For us, yes, because we work in specific sectors, so it's important for us to collect information on the income of a farmer from a particular crop, say maize or chili or jute. So at the end of the day, it is the income of the farmer, but our broad unit for outreach is the household. And what we try to do is when we capture the income of a farmer from a particular sector, we try to look at how the income is actually distributed or used within a household. So if I can go back to our earlier point, results chain. So for a particular intervention in a particular sector, if we go through the logical flow of how a service is being improved and how a service provider is providing the service to a particular farmer and how the farmer is actually using it and benefiting from it. So it is a farmer at that level. But then when we capture the income at a qualitative level, we try to see, okay, how is that income really used? And specifically, the role or the contribution of women in these sectors, as I mentioned before, is important for us. So through qualitative studies, we try to identify how that improved income has actually benefited the women of the household. Let me just give you an example. What we did in our last year's impact assessment, we went through a detailed impact assessment of how a particular intervention activity in the field actually resulted in increase in income for the farmer, which was to do with how he has improved the cultivation practice on a certain in a certain sector. What we did is we selected a group of households from that impact assessment who have said that they have benefited from the service, and then we conducted an in-depth qualitative study in those households to identify whether the additional income that came into the family due to all that benefits, how was that used? Were the women better off? Did they have better decision-making power there? I mean, what was the role there, and how did they contribute? And like Helen and I also mentioned in our previous comment, that it's a bit tricky to really look into intervention that mainstream gender aspects, especially where the role of women and men are both important very much in sectors like the agriculture. So for us, it is very important to also step aside and really talk to the women respondents of the household and really ask, okay, when your husband, for example, bought a better variety of the seed for the field, so when there was the information sharing being done by the service provider, how were you? Were you involved, or were you aware of this process? Were you informed of this improved technique? How did that happen? And did that improve your role in the field? So things like that. So we really tried to top up, if I can say, the quantitative impact data with the qualitative findings. So just to answer your question, Erin, is that yes, the unit of analysis for us at the end is the household, but while collecting the data, it is important for us to really look at the farm income from that particular sector. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to keep moving on because we have a few more things to get through. I want to get to questions. And in terms of, and I'm just going to move to what change is positive and negative, because I think this is also a very key point, because empowerment and defining the empowerment indicators in terms of what is positive change and what might be negative change can be a bit complex at times. And I think both of these projects have done a very good job at defining that. And I'm wondering if Helen, if you're still there, if you could speak and give us an example and speak to how your team defines what is positive and what is negative with a certain indicator.
Yeah, hello, I'm still here. I've come back again. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to obviously do no harm and know what you're doing. And when you're coming down to the household level, obviously, and starting to get quite hands-on, perhaps, in the surveys, you've got to be very careful to understand what you're doing. And I've missed, obviously, the research part of the seminar. But just to say that a lot of how we know how to define what's positive and negative comes out of our initial research, which has been gendered from the beginning. So all aspects of our market analysis, our focus group surveys, individual key informant interviews, gender analysis, obviously, it's all gendered. So we have a very, very good idea already of what is positive and what is negative. So if we looked, for example, at income, positive, defining the positive increases would be perhaps an increase in women keeping the money after the sale of a commodity they were selling, let's say milk in particular, or wool, so that if they have the money is paid to them, that they have some measure of agency, really, over the money. And then, again, another possible one, a positive definition could be the number of decisions made on, let's say, investing in livestock-related activities. Because for us, too, it's easier to measure things that are program-related. And as our target group is so firmly embedded in the rural sphere anyway, it's easier for us to measure livestock-related things. And with time use, for example, positive changes would be perhaps a reduction in drudgery, the amount of just sheer hard work that's reduced through improved efficiency. And then this one for me is really important. Women having the choice of what to do with any time saved. Not necessarily prescribing what they do with that, but that they have the choice to do with it what they will.
Great, thank you, Helen. That's a perfect segue, actually, into the next slide, which is a basket of indicators, we're calling it, for household-level women's economic empowerment indicators. And this basket of indicators is quite detailed in the paper in terms of the rationale for use, why they were chosen, but in a very high-level overview, all of these are based on the M4C and ALCC experiences, along with an extensive literature review. So we came up with these indicators that, of course, need to be tailored to projects and are not relevant to every project, which is why we're calling it a basket. But the first one, in terms of access to income, is really addressing that access to resources piece, where all the rest of them are actually addressing that agency side, or that ability for people to act on the opportunities that are available to them. So I thought, I guess to make one quick note, and then I want to turn it over to Fabia and Helen, but I think the key piece here that we noted for M4C and ALCC is that they took these indicators and made them very project specific. And then they also basically chose indicators based on not only the relevance to the project, but also the capacity to measure well. And I thought that that was also a very, very interesting point, and just interesting, you can see in the paper some tools for how they condense the amount of indicators that they're measuring to really get the right indicators. So I thought maybe I could ask Helen and Fazia now, if you had to pick 2 household-level indicators to measure women's economic empowerment at the household level, what 2 do you think are the most critical to use for each of your projects? What has been your experience?
Okay, who's going first?
Helen, you want to go first?
Okay, I will. All right. So, well, access in all its forms pretty much is measured anyway. I mean, if you're doing your gender disaggregated data properly for job scale and income, you will get your access figures anyway. So then it leaves you really with the agency indicators. And for our program specifically, time use, as I've already said, would be huge, because it's so much to do with this efficiency and the reduction in drudgery and access to more time. So that's a really big one for us, and it specifically relates to things like moving from the production of cheese to the sale of liquid milk. So we can measure the amount of time. We can say we know how long it makes to make cheese, and so we can measure how much time is saved fairly easily. And then the other one is this decision making. It's related to income, but the thing is about that, you often hear it couched in terms of control over income, which becomes a very tricky topic, I think, to define, and you can get into quite difficult water, perhaps, within the household, trying to define what actually control is. so that's where we might look at something more specifically and do look at expenditure. So expenditure over livestock-related things in particular, but we're also interested as well as expanding that perhaps to look at, well, it's another form of expenditure perhaps, but investments, making investments in things, so decisions into investing in something, be it land or another cow, and savings, the possibility of making any savings. And then one further thing for our program, which I have to support really, is that we also do access to decision making, and it's public decision making. That's actually very easy to measure, and I would, if it's often a common issue across many programs, and it's an easy one to measure. So that for me is a great indicator to include.
Great, thank you, Helen. Flavia, I'm going to skip to the next slide, and then I think I'll ask you to answer that next question, if that's okay.
Sure.
We're looking now at measuring the actual changes in women's economic empowerment. And we found that there were really 4 important elements to actually measuring these changes. So the first one is finding innovative ways to integrate women's economic empowerment and research questions around women's economic empowerment into commonly used private sector development research tools. The second one is to establish an actual process for collecting this information over time. And both projects here had articulated and visually depicted this process for staff, which I think it was very helpful in terms of staff being able to articulate when they were actually integrating these concepts of women's economic empowerment and into which tools. The third piece was understanding good gender responsive research practices, and the last, what we're calling collect reliable household level data on these. And on that last one, you'll see in the paper, we have a lot of specifics around the different indicators and how both the M4C and ALCP programs, kind of what they did, what they used, specific research questions. So you can find that all in the full paper. So right now I want to focus on that understanding good gender responsive research practices. And I'd like to ask Flavia if she could talk a little bit about her project experience and giving us some tips for how to conduct this type of research.
Thank you, Erin. Some of the learnings from the field and from the team on conducting this kind of research was interesting. We actually conducted the first women's economic empowerment assessment in the field early this year, and it was completely done in-house by our own team, and it was definitely a learning process. So some of the things that we realized that it is very important to really define the indicators in the tools according to the local context. And by that I mean that in certain areas where we were interviewing, we found that certain issues were not really could not be openly discussed with the women, like how well are you contributing in decision making. So we have to use a bit of proxy questions to do that. So in the process, the team had to be quite flexible and clever enough to change the checklist or the questionnaire to maneuver according to the respondent. So there's a very important need to really have these kind of repetitive questions so that we actually try to get the answer out of the respondent. It's also important to really have a very simple questionnaire, because when we interview some of the women, and if the interview takes, for example, 1.5 to 2 hours, it is not done. I mean, they have a lot of work to do. So I think it's like keeping it simple and short. That's also difficult, but at the same time, it was very important to really focus on few major issues. And what we also try to do is, at the end of conducting interviews in a particular region, we try to validate that through a focus group discussion. So that kind of filled in the gaps, if there were any, in terms of some of the issues we were trying to find out, as well also gave us opportunity to validate some of our findings. The other important thing is that for women who work in the field as family labor or as unpaid labor, they don't consider work as, I mean, they just do the work out of, because it's a family farm and things like that, but it's very important to define what that work means to them before we start into this. So again, going back to my earlier comment, that it's very important to identify the role of women in a particular production activity and how she is contributing to it. And while asking the questions to the respondent, to be absolutely clear that this is what we are meaning. So yeah, these would be few things that we have learned in the field. And definitely next time when we do it, we will keep these things in mind while developing the services.
Excellent. Thank you, Fazia. And like you mentioned in the paper, there's a lot of details actually around this slide for each of the different indicator categories, as well as experiences from both of the projects, which is really quite interesting. The next piece I want to talk about now is systemic change. And here, as we know, most proposed indicators and frameworks for measuring systemic change assess changes among service providers or market actors rather than target beneficiaries. And to my knowledge, no private sector development programs to date have viewed household level changes when they're looking at types of systemic change, but rather they're looking at household level changes as results of systemic change. However, I do think that there is increasing interest to view the household as an actual system or a subsystem itself. And I think this has been less explored, but in this new light, household level changes might be more aligned with looking at system level change. So I guess my question here, maybe I'll give it to Helen, just because we're running a little short on time, is do you think that household level changes are a type of systemic change? And if so, maybe you could give an example of the types of spillover effects at the household level that could be measured.
I think that's quite a difficult question, really. But we do measure copying, and copying at the I mean, it has to be at the household level for us, because our enterprise that we measure is actually the farmer. It actually is the household. So we do measure that, and of course, so we have lots and lots of access data. And so the best example I can give at this point of the actual access part leading to behavioral change that we know we've got impact on is, for example, using the agricultural supplement in the newspaper, and then from having read that, adopting a new practice, or buying something new, or telling somebody about it, and they do something new. There's also increasing evidence of copying more generally. Let's say, somebody is vaccinating their cows or something, and other people say, oh, that's good, I'll do that as well. So we know it on that level, but I suppose you're asking then about the next step, which is then how that impacts in the household. And I suppose I think that's going to be quite hard to do, but it is doable. But I think, you see, it would probably, part of that would come out when you started looking at decision-making over investments in livestock or stuff like that. And also, just to mention as well, the oldest section of this Alliances program, which started in 2008 in Samsko-Jabacheti, they did do, SDC asked for a broader impact assessment at, it was a pretty big survey done at the sort of regional level, and they were looking at the impact in a much broader sense, whether it had impacted on education, expenditure, or welfare. And anyway, there seemed to be evidence, well, there was evidence that women were spending more on education for their children who'd been beneficiaries of the program. So yeah, you can capture it, and you can consider it systemic change.
Great. Thank you, Helen. So should we take this time to answer. Here, I'll actually move to the next slide. Sorry, one second. I want to talk a bit about program costs, because I know this is always a question that comes up, but it is extremely context relevant and will change quite a bit by program. But I do think it's really important to hear from both M4C and ALCT, because I think what we've seen is that there are some additional costs, and this will need to be incurred yet. It may be a bit less than what many people are expecting to hear. And I'm wondering if each of you, or maybe Fazia, if you could speak a bit to some of the additional costs and how significant it was to your overall results measurement budget.
Yeah. On the cost, not much really. I mean, like I mentioned, we really try to integrate the topic in all our ongoing MR monitoring and results measurement studies, because depending on how we monitor a particular results chain of an intervention, we develop the tools and the studies, and within those we have questions very relevant for the women economic empowerment issues. The two main areas I would say where we felt we would definitely need to plan additional costs is first to really develop proper and informed guidelines on mainstreaming gender in a project. And it's important because with there are a lot of projects that are or M4P or the PLT programs that are implementing and trying a lot different means of addressing the same issues. So it's important to really understand the experiences and then also not technically reinvent the wheel. So there I think we did involve a bit of international experts, national experts on the topic, and really try to come up with this more cohesive kind of a guideline. So I think that was a bit of a cost for us in the initial period of the program, because for me it was very important from the very beginning to have some sort of guidelines in place for the team to actually apply, rather than just start doing things on their own and then come back to the board. That's number one. Number two, I think we as the program management team should definitely invest in developing the capacity of the people. Now, in our case, we do a lot internally with a lot of example-oriented meetings and workshops, build the capacity of our team and also the other implementing organization stuff. So that also is a bit resourceful, of course, from the time perspective. And of course, if you get good people to train, of course, the cost of those people are also not cheap. So that would be another area. But overall, if I can really talk about the recent qualitative study on women's economic empowerment that we have done, one of the agenda we had was to really learn from the field, so we did really in-house, and it was really the staff time that was required. So I think there, the trick would be to just plan this well enough ahead so that we just allocate the right time to do it. Thanks.
Great. So I'd like to just take this time, because I know that we're running out of time, and we want to answer a couple of these extremely interesting questions that people are writing up here on the board to us. So I thought I could quickly answer one and then turn it over to Fazia and Helen to each pick a question and give an answer to it. One I wanted to quickly respond to is from, hopefully I'm saying your name correctly, but to Kamil Arif. And you asked a question about, did we consider the sexual and reproductive health rights of women? And I'm guessing that you're asking this in the context of including this in that basket of indicators. So what I wanted to mention is that I definitely considered it, and I did quite a bit of reading on it, and I think it's a very, very important and relevant issue to women's economic empowerment. And if your project is focused on wanting to affect changes in that area, I think it is very important for you to include that into your change logic and into your matching indicators. But the reason why we left that out, and we also left out issues around land tenure, is that both of these issues should really be measured if the program is addressing these directly. So if a program is not working on these issues, we're not including them in that basket of indicators, and we're not recommending them to be used because they can be quite a bit more challenging than others to attribute changes in these areas to the program. So that's the key reason. And this we explore quite a bit more in the attribution section of the full paper. But detecting these changes in these indicators is very difficult to attribute change, and it also takes quite a long time to see these changes if your program is not trying to address this directly. So that's why we left that out. So now maybe, Fawzi, I'll turn it over to you. I don't know if there was a question that you saw that you might want to answer.
Yeah, I'm just actually going through them. It's just so difficult to keep track. Yeah, I see one or two which I can quickly touch upon. Fiona, I think you had a question on, is it possible to compare result change for women as entrepreneurs versus wage workers and compare economic empowerment outcomes? Maybe quickly on that, for us, we also try to track impact of our intervention or of our activities on women who are contributing to the sector as paid labor as well as unpaid labor, and in some cases, like in the case of handicrafts, as producers. So what we I don't know what you exactly mean by compare, but of course your results change should show, depending on the kind of intervention, because at the very beginning of an intervention, the program should decide what it is targeting, and in certain cases, if the target is to really achieve increase in productivity in a particular sector, which results in increase in job opportunities for the women in that particular sector, then that needs to be monitored, versus another sector where you want to probably increase the access to services to the women who work as handicraft producers, which would lead to increasing income. So I think it's possible to have results change that has all this aspect, but it really depends on the design of your intervention, and you can definitely put indicators at the top level of your results chain to monitor each of these categories. Another question on from Atumani, which talks about what would program do in terms of setting up the basis for measurement of gender indicators apart from having standardized gender indicators. I think for a project, I think it's very important to really realize which indicators are relevant to the project. So, of course, it's important to look at the standardized indicators, but from the kind of sectors or context a project will be working in, it's important to really determine which indicators are important. And like Erin mentioned in her paper, there is a basket full of indicators that a PLC program can use, but it's up to you actually to really determine which of these indicators make sense and really select them. It has to be very much project-centric, project-specific, so that the team is really aware of these indicators way before they implement the work in the field, and it's also clear for them what to monitor, when to monitor, and how to really learn from this. So, yeah, I would say that would be the two questions I pick up from this whole list. Thanks.
This is Jim again here. I'm very aware. Helen, are you still with us?
I am, but I can't see any questions because I'm on the telephone.
You can't see any questions, so
No.
and practically speaking, we'll just have to give you the microphone to make any final comment that you think needs to be made from your experience.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Well, final comment. Everybody always says it constantly, that gender should be everybody's responsibility and should be in the project right from the beginning and be in every aspect of the project. And I can only say that this is absolutely true. And I really believe that this gender thing, including asking in many ways how much this is going to cost, is an issue that I hope will will just naturally come to an end, in the sense that it will become so normal to do this that it won't even be questioned. I mean, if you just say to yourself and to the whole team that this is how it is, and you do it and you put the tools and mechanisms in place to do it from the beginning, it becomes so much easier. I mean, answering questions about indicators makes total sense when you've got a fully gendered market analysis and all your tools are flexible enough and sensitive enough to capture the differences. It's just a calibration, a recalibration perhaps, of what you expect to have to do. You just have to do more, perhaps, but I wouldn't see it as more. I'd just see it as sort of good practice and due diligence to make sure that you achieve the impact that you should achieve in a private sector development program, which is impact for men and women, and that's it really. And recently had an interesting debate with some people about targeting women in an intervention, and was trying to explain that obviously targeting women was a way of addressing basically a key cross-cutting constraint that meant that women weren't being impacted properly. In our case, it's this access to decision-making. I think a lot of these arguments will probably just disappear. They'll become natural. And the other thing is getting the right attitude in the office. Operationally, in your organization, the attitude has to be right, that it's a positive thing, that men don't feel pressured by it or anxious about it, or even worse things really, because of the way it might have been portrayed in the past. If it's open, shared, and integrated in everything that you do, and the training is given to people so that they have the tools, they know the basics, gender equity, access and control, roles and responsibilities. If they know all that, and the operational culture is such that it can be discussed at all times, it works.
Helen, thank you very much. Fawzia and Erin, maybe Fawzia first. Is there something we've missed here or not yet had a chance to touch on?
Yeah, just one point maybe. I think it's, again, Helen did such a good job in saying it all, but I think it's important really for the project staff to realize the importance of this issue. And I think, frankly speaking, for me in the project to begin with, it was really to build the ownership of the team, to really understand, to be flexible, to take the challenge of addressing these issues in the field, because this is not easy. And there's been a lot of debates around this issue for projects like the PhD one. So I think it's really, for a new project or for any project, it's very important to have the team on board with this particular topic and give them enough flexibility and time to learn how to address this particular activity. So that would be the only thing I would like to add here.
Thank you. That sounds very important. Erin, final comment from your side.
Yeah, just a quick last comment, because like Fawzia said, I think Helen and Fawzia have done a great job explaining and concluding the importance of addressing women's economic empowerment in private sector development. And I think one piece that they're both talking about right now is really managing that gender responsive system for results measurement. And I think that really is kind of a critical backbone to making this all work. And I think both the M4C and ALC projects have done this in a very, very interesting way. And we've detailed some of that, again, in the paper. But I did want to point out that it's not just about the actual good, MRM practices that adequately address gender, which is one piece of it, but really ensuring that the processes are gender sensitive. And how do you promote diversity in hiring women in your workforce and the training that people need to be able to, to actually implement these pieces adequately? And what does it mean, to actually get people on board and create that buy-in? So I think just to leave it on that note, because I think that that's really interesting and something that the leadership of both Helen and Fazia have really done a very interesting job at. So I hope that you all get the chance to read the paper. And if you have any questions, please do send them our way. I think our emails are posted somewhere, because I'm sure all of us would love to help people in their endeavors to integrate women's economic empowerment more effectively into their programming. So thank you again for joining us.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. So I think I will wrap things up now. It's been extremely rich hour, and I'd like to thank particularly the presenters and also everyone who has joined. We should be able to get a recording of the hour online within a couple of days, and we will see about a summary. We actually have tried to summarize previous webinars, so we'll have a go at this. We do want, I think, comments as well on Erin's report. What you have a link to, what you should have a link to, hopefully, is a summary, and there's a longer report that's due out fairly soon. So your input at this stage is very welcome. Otherwise, thank you very, very much for joining, and we will meet again in cyberspace. Let me close it now, and thank you, and goodbye.